everyone. Thanks for joining our first online-only ACAT today. I'm just going to start with acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people whose land we're meeting on here virtually, many of us. Recognise the strength of resilience and capacity of the Noongar people where Curtin University is situated, and I acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. And today I will now introduce you to Neve Quigley, who's a research associate in the Centre for Culture and Technology, who's just completed a project called Grey Literature Research Outputs at MCASI. This research was funded by the School of MCASI and the Media Culture Technology stream in that research stream in that school. So Neve, I'll hand it over to you now for your presentation.
Thanks, Katie. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners where I am. I'm also in Whadjuk Noongar country, where I live, and I do all my deep thinking. And I want to say yanka to the custodians who cared for this land over many, many years. So welcome to all of you, whether you're joining us live or watching the recording later on. I have put a copy of the presentation on Zenodo, and we'll share the link online on the CCAT website as well. And you can ask questions in the chat while I'm talking, and I'll have a look at the end, or you can just unmute and ask me directly at the end. So this was a 5-week project, and the lovely thing about this was I got to do it over a few months. So we had no ethics delays, no recruitment delays. It just all happened really nicely over a long period of time. Katie and I wanted to find out more about grey literature. So today we'll have a look at what is grey literature, the benefits, the negatives, the complications, talk about the project approach. We'll share findings from our focus groups and a small audit of grey literature, and finish up with some recommendations for Curtin as an institution and some tips which are directly for anyone who creates grey literature. So most of us are familiar with grey literature, that's reports, white papers, things like that, but the definition is huge. It includes conference papers, blog posts, thesis, and some newer types of things like infographics, podcasts, and interview recordings. And one of the participants in the focus group raised the point that the definition isn't really fixed because there's going to be new ways. There's going to be new ways to share research. So basically the message is for everyone to keep an open mind as researchers continue to experiment. So let's look at one example, which many of you have heard of before. So this was a position paper from 2018 from the Centre for Culture and Technology. It's about audio description. So this is classic grey literature, and it was really impactful because it changed the way Australia's broadcasters do audio description, and it introduced it. So that's had a huge impact on a community of people. And you can see there's also a beautiful infographic, which is more grey literature, which is about the research and about the impact that the research had. So it could be at all different kind of levels. So benefits of preserving grey literature is that you can have it more visible over a longer time, and it makes citations and statistics a lot easier because it's all built in, able to track it. It's less likely to be lost or disappear. We had a few examples in the focus group where researchers recounted how they knew of instances where grey literature had been lost, either at the end of a project or someone forgot to renew a domain name. So grey literature is really vulnerable on websites as opposed to when it's in repositories. There's also barriers, and we'll have a little look at these in the focus group findings as well. So busy researchers don't have enough time or resources to do that extra bit of putting the grey literature into a repository or sharing it in that way. There could be privacy issues. They just can't share, or they may not have permission from the funders or the sponsors as well. So we'll have a look at the project approach. I ran 2 focus groups with 4 participants in each, ran an audit of about 18 pieces of grey literature, and that was to see what's current practice, not to criticize or say this is wrong. It's more to get an idea of what's actually happening. And the third part of the project was to create a really practical self-help guide that researchers could use to put in some better practices around grey literature. So we'll look at findings from the focus groups first, and these were run in January and February, and the transcripts are de-identified and available online, and I've got links at the end, so anyone can read them if you wish to, and the question guide is there too. So why is grey literature important to these 8 participants who were all researchers in MCASI and actively producing grey literature? So it's really important to them. They create a lot and they use it to speak to those communities and really carry research findings out much further than journal articles or books, which are more traditional methods of dissemination. It's impactful, and it has been more impactful than traditional literature, like journals and books, for 2 of the participants. And it's almost in a different language, and it speaks to more people who don't need to have insight into those academic ways of journal articles. So we know it's important and impactful, but there's also negatives. It's really time intensive to not just put the polish on the grey literature, but to get it out there and preserve it and put it in a repository and even know what to do, how to do all of those things. So it's time consuming. It can also be invisible. And some of the participants felt grey literature is really not recognized officially at an institutional level. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So as part of the focus groups, we talked about what researchers, media, culture, and technology researchers are currently doing, how they're saving and disseminating their grey literature. Massive list of types, and this was just 8 focus group participants, and they're doing this all as well as journal articles and books, and teaching and their own research as well. And who are they collaborating with? They're actually building relationships and networks far beyond Curtin University, internationally and with industry and community. And that's really, really important. And in some cases, working really collaboratively with those communities as well. So where are the focus group participants storing their grey literature? Currently, it's mostly on websites. And not much in repositories. And as mentioned before, this makes all of that grey literature a lot more vulnerable to being lost. And how are these focus group participants sharing their grey literature? Really widely. So they're putting a lot of work into this dissemination part of grey literature and sharing it quite intensively. So we talked a little bit in the focus groups about what researchers would like to happen. They want better guidelines for storing and sharing grey literature, and more support and better workflows. So the simple things and knowing what to do, what is best practice, what's some options for repositories, where should they save things. And one point that we touched on already was support for where project funding is finished and basically a website has no more money to keep going. What happens in that case? One of the participants shared that it was really difficult to find out how to do this, or does Curtin even do this? And we talked about the value of grey literature. And the answer to is grey literature valued is yes and no. So it's very much valued where researchers have told their head of school or their managers or their colleagues, it is valued in that way, but it's not being captured in systems such as Elements. And that makes it really difficult for it to flow through to eSpace and to any preparation that's made for promotion as well. So one of the themes that was noted during thematic analysis using Corona-Clark's method was that there were inequities for researchers who do a lot of grey literature. We've seen that it's a really impactful way to share with communities, and it contributes to building relationships. So how does it fit into promotion and publishing? One of the researchers acknowledged their privilege in being able to ignore the rules. They keep making grey literature even though they know that they have to work the system to have it recognized in promotion process. And another participant, P6, really felt that some research topics are way more attractive than others, and that there was an inequity there in terms of what they research and the grey literature that comes out of that. With regards to promotion, some participants of the focus groups felt that the promotion system is really inequitable for grey literature creators. It's not really represented in the guidelines. There's no clear examples. There is a section on engagement, but not enough information about how you would use your grey literature. You're not going to have a journal impact factor. Might not have good citation statistics or downloads. It's more about expressing the value of the grey literature. And some felt that this could be a deterrent for researchers who produce grey literature in going for promotion, because that preparation process is a lot more difficult when you can't just pull a report out which has all of your work listed on it. So the grey literature audit was just a few simple checks for about 18 pieces of grey literature. These were mostly white papers, reports, position papers, submissions to government. So I looked at things like, did they have a persistent identifier, like a digital object identifier or an ISBN? Was there a record of them in eSpace, Curtin's institutional repository? Were they actually downloadable from eSpace? Were they findable online, just using a Google search? And were they available from the Analysis and Policy Observatory, which is a repository website specific to Australia, and they collect grey literature, and it's fully open access, available to everyone. So a quick summary of the findings from the audit. There were a lot of things on websites rather than in repositories, and in one case, multiple copies of one item with different file names. So really hard to tell which is the version of truth. Some of the grey literature was in eSpace just as metadata, so just title, date, and with a link to somewhere else in some cases. But none of it was available to download from eSpace as an attached file. And that's partly to do with how eSpace is fed by Elements. And not everything was shared with APO as well. So it was really interesting to see just a small look. It's not indicative of all grey literature because there's only 18 items, but it kind of shows the gaps that we could help with some guidelines. So part of the project was to create a self-help guide for researchers to answer some of their questions, and so they could feel a bit more empowered and know what to do and answer some of their questions. So the sections in the guide are how can you get a DOI in the first place? So you can actually get one from Curtin University Library. You just get in touch with them and the process is in the guide. You can get one from lots of different repositories. There's I've explained a few repositories and their pros and cons because they're not all equal in terms of how long they guarantee to look after what you put in them. And they're not all equal in terms of what kind of Creative Commons licenses they offer. The guide also includes examples and templates of metadata, so something that you can copy and paste into your next report, quite usable, and a little bit about the easy way to get your grey literature into ORCID once you have DOI, and some tips for sharing as well. And it's very much designed to be not sequential. You can just dip in and read the bit that you need to. So we'll have a look at an example. So this is from a real report that I wrote with Professors Lucy Montgomery and Professor Cameron Nayland. So we can see I've highlighted the different pieces of metadata. So this was on page 2 of the report. So you can see it's really clear what the copyright is, who contributed. So that can be a reviewer. It doesn't have to be an author. So if you've had help from the community that you work with, if they've been involved in the work, you can give them credit there as well if you have permission to do that. Really important to put a date in. I'm sure you've all come across grey literature where there's no date and no contact. So you can't even tell who to get in touch with if you have questions about it. And a funder, if it was funded research as well. So all of this is in the guide, so you can just copy it and paste it into yours. So I am talking more about reports and that kind of thing rather than blog posts. And here's the same report in a repository. So Zenodo is a free repository. It's anyone in the world can use it for any kind of research topic, and you just pop in your information and they will give you a DOI, which you can then share. You can add multiple versions if you need to change what you've done. And you can see that it's got the little green ORCID ID logo. And that's because I added our ORCIDs in when I uploaded this to Zenodo. So everything is connected in that way. You can see the funder is really clear at the bottom. And we'll just have another look at 2 more parts of that page in Zenodo. So you've got a DOI. You can also add keywords about your grey literature, which makes it a lot easier for people who don't know what they're looking for to find it. And really nice views and downloads statistics. So that can be used to add evidence if you want to show how, not necessarily how impactful something has been, because it doesn't mean that the people who downloaded it did anything, but they did look at it and they did download it. So that's a start. And just to carry that through to ORCID, so because you have a DOI, it's really easy. You just add your DOI and ORCID will talk to Zenodo and suck everything in, so you don't have that painful double manual entry of data, because it just automatically happens. And you get to have a look at it and accept it, and you can edit it if you're not happy with any of it as well. So all of that's covered in the guide on how to do that. So to wrap it up, these were the 4 project deliverables. We have the guide and the report. They're both under internal review at the moment, but should be finished soon. And 2 pieces of research data. So our project on grey literature produced more grey literature using best practice, which is good. And these are the 4 outputs. And looking into the future, what needs to change? So on an institutional level, really need better guidelines around storing and sharing of grey literature. A few of the participants mentioned elements categories, and this is a recurring theme in my research, that elements is not set up to reflect the actual things that researchers are making and doing. More institutional support for end of project, so that information doesn't just disappear and all of that grey literature goes somewhere and researchers don't have to fund it out of their own money. And a more formal recognition of grey literature in the promotion process, so that researchers who do produce a lot of grey literature are not at a disadvantage. So we'll finish with some practical tips for grey literature creators. So the minimum things you should try and record So this could be a blog post, author, date, copyright, if you're happy for it to be shared, funder, and some kind of contact info. So it applies to reports as well. And then once you've got that right, challenge yourself a bit more and try to add a description of what it is, a version, keywords, and a suggested citation. And my key takeaway is try repositories and don't put grey literature straight on a website because it does make it vulnerable, and take advantage of what comes with DOIs. You can see citations, you can see downloads, and you can add it into ORCID really easily as well. So there's all of those advantages that you don't really see at the time, but you get the benefit of them later on. So I'd like to say thank you to the focus group participants. I know researchers are really busy, but every time I ask for interviewees, there is such a good response, and I really appreciate your time. And I'd like to thank Katie as well for the opportunity to work on this project. It ties in really well with my interest in open access and connecting to communities that research is about as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the chat. Thank you.